pandemic that Mr. Ranjan was referring to and how the governments kind of respond to it, as we all know, it brought about unprecedented uncertainties globally and in every sector of industry. And so we're going to get into the caveat section of what Mr. Ranjan said, but also how industries kind of negotiated with the pandemic. Artificial intelligence has had its own set of challenges, of course, even before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And the community has emerged with some learnings. So we're going to talk about all of that, and to understanding these learnings for our first panel of today on AI and the pandemic, the big takeaways, I would like to call on stage three people, starting with from the United Arab Emirates, Tannya Jajal. Tannya Jajal is a tech evangelist, an AI expert and futurist. She's been promoting future leaders in their exploration of ethical and practical implications of exponential technologies in business life and on the social front. And also joining us now from the UAE is Roberto Croci. Roberto is the managing director at Microsoft for startups, MEA, and a leading innovator in developing ecosystems. He's also worked towards bridging the gap between corporates and startups in more than 20 countries. And he's here. And also, finally, joining us from New Delhi, where, we're both sharing the not so good air between us. Swetabh Pathak is here. He's the co-founder and CTO at Elucidata in the field of biomedical molecular data. Through his biological big data platform, they're helping facilitate drug discovery. So we have people straddling different aspects of AI. And so I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Welcome, Tannya, Roberto, and Swetabh. Let me begin by asking each one of you the same question. And maybe in the beginning, if you can give me quick, crisp answers, we can develop your thoughts and add in a few other questions into the mix. So let me ask each of you the following question. What has, from your perspective, changed, improved, or become worse in the field of artificial intelligence technologies across industries during the pandemic? Are there any big sweeping takeaways? I'll start with you, Roberto, then go to Tannya, and then Swetabh.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Venkatesh, and thank you for inviting us and the other panelists to this great event. So to your question, so we see that the future growth across all industries and the business models of the organizations with them will definitely be driven in large part by applying a new breed of digital technologies to more intelligently engage customers, transform products and services, optimize operations, and empower employees, right? So these are areas where we are deeply involved into building products and solutions and technology that ourselves first, but also our customers will be able to leverage. Just to give an example, the whole Microsoft as a whole, right, runs over AI. So all AI models that are used in Microsoft products such as Office, Xbox, etc., are trained on Azure. And not only does Azure enable Microsoft data science teams to train sophisticated models, but also Azure serves as the inferencing platform for all Microsoft products, right? So we embedded AI into what we do. And just as an example, in the last few months, we have seen close to 2 million hours of speech transcribed in Teams meetings. And this is using the speech cognitive services. Or the PowerPoint designer models are built and inferenced using Azure machine learning. And to date, we have over 1 billion PowerPoint designer slides that have been used. Or think about the Xbox. Xbox uses the personalizer service that is based on reinforcement learning to provide over 80 million personalized experiences on Xbox dashboards every single day. And these are just a few examples that show how AI is being used even by ourselves first, right? Before talking about how we're enabling our customers to power the AI experiences in all Microsoft products. So to your point, we have seen a lot of development, but for in terms of AI technology. But what I think is also important is our customer promise that is grounded into three principles. One is we are building AI on your terms, which means we are relentlessly focused on empowering developers of all skill levels and enabling them to use the tools and languages of their choice. The second principle is mission critical. So this is important to enable organizations to deploy with confidence and having AI services that are hardened for the most demanding workloads. And finally, and this is also very important as we're talking about AI for good, is this principle of responsibility. We have an uncompromising commitment to responsible AI, built on the most trusted cloud, Azure, with best privacy controls. We believe that responsible AI capabilities and most compliant certification of any cloud in the world are key to develop products. And we've seen a lot of development also when it comes to building responsible AI, ethical AI, and principles around that. So these are guiding principles that enable us to fulfill our mission to empower every developer and every organization to harness the potential of AI.
Okay. Roberto, a little later in the conversation, I'm going to ask you that question again about, where we're getting stuck, if we're getting stuck. But Tannya, your quick takeaway from the pandemic?
I'm glad Roberto ended on that note, because my quick takeaway from this is that the pandemic has really shed light on how important ethics and responsible use of AI is in the current world, right? I think this whole field of technology policy, specifically AI policy, is kind of a black box for a lot of people. But today, if we want to roll out artificial applications that are used by everyone, right, by employees sitting at home who are running applications on the cloud that are AI embedded in them, to individuals who are at airports who are having facial recognition systems, taking their data, all of this points to a really important field, a multidisciplinary field, which requires the support of technologists, governments, as well as individuals. And another really important place, of course, is misinformation, right? Today, we can use AI, hopefully, to spread information about the pandemic and about future crises that we will no doubt encounter. I think the pandemic has shed a lot of light on that specifically. So I'm keen to explore that later.
Yes, certainly. This is a topic that is very close to the work we do at Boom as well. So we'll definitely come back to it a little later. Swetabh, your takeaways?
So thanks so much, Venkatesh, for having me. I think there are a couple of directions that I can maybe contribute to the discussion on. One is, of course, sort of because I come from the world where where we have been obsessed with vaccines and how to create new therapies for this pandemic, right, and how to do that in the most quickest way possible. And I think there, of course, a lot of AI has been very relevant. I mean, discovery teams today use a lot more artificial intelligence enabled insight generation than they used to. That's only sort of becoming more accelerated, right? Of late, for example, you might have read about AlphaFold, which is a technology that is making it easier to come up with compound structures. Again, sort of helps the drug discovery process move faster. So, for example, when you think about the new drug that Pfizer is just about to bring to the clinic, not a vaccine but a drug. And so for those kind of things, it has been instrumental. What we have seen in our own experience, we make this platform called Poly, which hosts about 1 million data sets that can be used by R&D scientists to understand disease better. And there's been a lot of interest, for example, in understanding the behavior of similar infectious diseases. People did not always have the data for COVID-19, but they were looking at diseases which are quote unquote similar. So that has been like, in sort of my direct line of work, what we do at Elucidator, that has been a big change. I think the other direction, which, maybe because we are at AI for Good conference, we should talk about is how AI is being used to spread misinformation, as the panelists before me said, as well as, I think, to encourage behavior, which is not always for the betterment of the world. And I think that's a very important area for practitioners of AI and generally the community to think about, how social media platforms are using AI, and is that reasonable? I think those are, within healthcare, for example, right, there's a lot more awareness of how you need to protect patient data, how do you need to anonymize. These things are not perfect, but that privacy first approach, is definitely being adopted by companies like us, right? So, for example, that's part of the reason why people use our platform Poly, because you can get the anonymized data from patients. But what are our privacy standards for social media, and how should we think about going forward? I think those are important questions for the world to answer.
Yes, indeed. Again, privacy, misinformation, making sure that extreme speech doesn't thrive on all our public spaces. These are all focus areas for us here at Boom. And I mean, I'm glad you brought it up, two panelists, because this is just to say that during the pandemic, it's not like the misinformation flow eased or anything. But if anything, especially with relation to COVID, it increased. But thankfully, we did not see the kind of exponential growth in misinformation that one would assume can come from the kind of exponential, what's the word for it? The exponential capabilities of AI technologies. And on that note of exponential growth, I'm going to come to you, Swetabh, a little later. But back to you, Roberto. The reason I like this particular conversation is, we have one person representing a big corporation. You have one person who looks into and reads into trends in the AI space. We have one person from the startup space. So I'm going to try and ask you the same question, unless, of course, other topics come through, which is, the field of artificial intelligence has grown in spurts ever since. I mean, I was reading that the official founding was in that small workshop in 1956 at Dartmouth College in the United States. And that this growth, it always, it comes in, there's great excitement, there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of investment that comes in. And then there is the inevitable disappointment. And then there is a more sober reassessment of what is possible. So that's the entire cycle. And then, we've had several cycles in the last few decades. My question to you is, regardless of the pandemic, are we in an AI winter wherein there is disappointment, or are we in the AI spring where, for the last 10 years, we've had a lot of excitement in this space? Do you see the space continuing to expand like this? Do you see continuation for all the excitement, or are there disappointments coming down the curve?
Thank you for the question, Venkatesh. It's a great question. I don't know if you remember, there was this book. It was also a movie with Peter Sellers, the Gardener, where there was a passage where it was saying, first there is spring and summer, and then autumn and winter, and then again spring and summer. Right. So if you look long term, maybe we are in autumn, then there will be spring. If you're spring, then there will be an autumn afterwards. Right. So I'm an optimist. So, but the thing is that what you just mentioned, it doesn't have to do with the technology per se, right? So it's more what are the barriers and how human beings, are using this technology and are trying to solve real problems, right? So the beauty of the panel today, you said there is a corporate, there is a startup here, there are different perspectives represented, and the conversation gets interesting because if I am a corporate, I on one hand, I've built these alignments around my core business that prevents me to be agile. Then I have this fear of being disrupted. Lifespan of Fortune 500 companies decreased 75 years, a few years back, 25, 15, and it's decreasing. And how can I tap into this new technology? But that's not probably the starting point. Is how can I be irrelevant? Or probably the first question should be, why do I exist as a corporation, right? So to serve what needs, to what my customers are buying it to. On the other hand, we have startups that come with more agile approach. They see these issues, they reimagine a different world, and they're trying to do that. And to do that, they also use technology because it's an enabling factor for scale and to reach millions of people, right? So, and to grow faster. So we are in the middle of that. I believe that I'm an optimist. I believe we are in a spring in the sense that technology is there, technology has been there. But there are some key drivers that organizations of any scale, whether it's a startup or a big organization, they need to face, they need to be aware of, and they need to work on to enable the usage of this technology, to enable the more usage of AI. Eventually, in the future, everything will be sort of AI-driven somehow, because there is a lot of data available, a lot of signals, a lot of video recognition, speech-to-text, or whatever needed, right? So to have a sort of an AI algorithm behind. But the real issues will start from the culture first. So you need to transform the culture of the organization to understand what are the needs that you're trying to solve for, what are the problems, and how to leverage the technology in a responsible way. You mentioned before this issue about misinformation, and probably it has not been exponentially grow with the COVID, but that ultimately poses a question of the real issue behind that is not the misinformation, is the trust. Who do you trust in this world? And for example, the more we build AI algorithms, would you trust an algorithm that is biased in the first place, where, for example, I don't know, you're building something to recruit people, and this AI algorithm is filtering out people, right? So suggesting, hey, these are the best candidates. What if this algorithm is built by only white male engineers in California, for example, right? So it does the diversity of whoever built that algorithm and that model reflects into, and would you trust that? Who do you trust, right? And this is just a small example, not to get back to the biggest threats or problems that we are facing as a society. So culture is key, because when we build products, we need to factor the fact that we are building from everyone for everyone, and we are building with ethical principles in mind from the very beginning. And culture has to do also with how to enable the organization around ethics decisions. So it's looking at issues not only from the business perspective, but also from the ethical perspective. And then it's a matter of, to determine whether we are in an autumn or spring, I would say it's also a matter of capabilities, right? So do we have, and are we investing as an organization to build the capabilities that we need for our employees to understand where technology is coming in support of what we're trying to do, and build these capabilities around AI, to understand AI 360 degrees, not only from the deep technical concepts of how to build machine learning models and so on and so forth, but also the ethical implications, the business implications. You're still focusing on customers, right? And what about the data acquisition and the privacy of users? So all of this needs to come together, but it's driven, I believe, by culture. And I believe more organizations, probably because of a necessity right now, Satya put it very brilliantly in June 2020 when he was asked about the COVID pandemic. He said, well, in 2 months, we saw 2 years of digital transformation happen, right? So probably COVID accelerated sort of a necessity or an urgency for organizations to look into technology, to look into how to leverage more technology, how to redefine some processes to be more efficient, to be more agile, flexible. But again, what really needs to change is this fundamental question of trust that you addressed, for example, with the example of misinformation, and how to set and build a culture that drives the adoption of this technology in the right way for the employees, for the users, for the consumers, for everyone, for the mankind, right, for society at large.
Right, Roberto. My takeaway from those interesting points you raised is that we're definitely in an AI spring, and the pandemic actually kind of accelerated the kind of development we saw. So this is just like a broad perspective takeaway for me. Tannya, there is this. I want to ask you about that question about exponential growth, because we're now talking about how we're in an AI spring, and these tools are just getting better and better. And there is that old fable, right, about exponential growth, which is, you have a king who challenges a sage to a chess game, and the sage says that if I win, you would have to give me double the grains of rice, starting with each square. You've got to double it. And the king laughs and he says, you know what? Of course I can do it, no problem. And so he starts with one rice grain and he defeats the king in the chess game. And soon, by the third or fourth row, when the king and his people are weighing the amount of grains, he realizes that he's running out of grain for the entire kingdom. And if he completes the chessboard, he won't have enough grain even to cover the entire planet. So my question to you is, with this kind of exponential growth, what kind of breaks do you foresee that we should apply?
Breaks that we should apply, right? Yeah. The thing with exponential growth, another way to think about it was Ray Kurzweil, who's the former director of engineering at Google, who posits this. He says that if you were to take 30 linear steps ahead of point A, and each step is a foot in length, then you would end up 30 feet ahead of your starting point. But if you were to take 30 exponential steps, you would end up circumnavigating the globe 26 times. I don't know how accurate that is, but it points to the scale at which these technologies are growing. And no doubt, I'm an optimist as well, but the way that I like to think about it is that I'm a rational optimist. I'm optimistic based on evidence, based on the scientific method of inquiry. And the reason that I say that is because the way that AI is growing right now, as well as other exponential technologies that are on that curve, is that they no doubt will take society by surprise. I know that there's been a lot of disappointment around the use of AI to help us tackle the pandemic, but I agree with Roberto in the sense that I think a lot of those barriers come from individuals, right? I don't think we need to put the brakes. Specifically, we want to make sure we don't put the brakes on innovation, right? Very often when we try to come in with policymakers and legislators who try to do good, what that ends up doing is it ends up being a bane to the innovative process. And it's really important for us to not do that, especially today when we need to reimagine and rethink models for how we function, right? From the business model to societal structures, economic structures, educational models, and so on. But what's important is that we start to consider the role of ethics as a very key part and strategic part of any organization. I wouldn't be surprised if in the future, more and more organizations adopted the role of chief AI ethics officer, right, as part of the C-level executive board. And the reason that that's so prevalent is because it's no longer a wish-washy thing, right? We now actually need to be having these conversations and thinking about transparency, privacy, safety, robustness, et cetera, of these technologies, especially if we're going to use them in things like healthcare, right? To misinformation, one of the amazing things that I came across earlier was that the White House had launched the COVID-19, I think it's called the COVID-19 website, right? Which was led by the ALIN Institute for AI. And the website is powered by AI, and it allows researchers to quickly share knowledge and information about the aspects of research, right, about COVID-19. So there's always that balancing factor, whereas on the one hand, you can use AI to create deep fakes or to produce false news articles or to create misinformation. You can also use it to fact check and keep society in check and ensure we don't end up in a state of zero trust. Right? So it's not a question about putting on the brakes. It's rather a question about educating the public, educating the layperson. I don't think it's enough for only technologists or only scientists or only industry leaders to be thinking about this. We kind of need to disseminate because it's almost as critical as when we discovered fire, right? And I'll leave you with this note, which is, I always say this, especially to young people who I talk to about this, who are thinking about what jobs they'll do in the future. Technology itself is a double-edged sword. The fire that keeps us warm also burns our houses down. So how we leverage it is entirely up to us. But personally, I'm a huge advocate of not impeding the innovative process just because of legislative reasons or because of bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you brought up fire, which many people, I suppose, call the original technology, and what would have happened if it applied brakes on fire. And then you have, of course, the opposing kind of, what's the word for it? The example of so many technologies that have destroyed large parts of humanity. So where do we find the balance is the eternal question, I suppose. Swetabh, I want to ask you specifically from a field of, from your field of healthcare intersecting with data and intersecting, of course, with AI, what really is possible today because of the pandemic or maybe in spite of the pandemic, and what is not possible today? Maybe we can talk a little bit about what is not possible today.
Well, I mean, lots of things are not possible, right? I think within sort of healthcare, for example, I think, if you look at sort of how fast vaccines have come up, and about the 9-10 month timeline was, I think, almost the fastest that any vaccine has come. The previous best the world did was about 4.5 years, I believe. So that was possible for the pharma community at large, but it was not possible, thanks to AI, right? It was possible a lot more because of much longer, more fundamental research that went into what are called messenger RNAs, right? And that had been doing for a long time, right? So that made it possible. It wasn't necessarily due to AI that it happened. And I think we have to be aware of the limitations of AI and machine learning and those kind of things. So I think something that the pandemic has really shifted within healthcare, I think, is people's acceptance to telemedicine. I think we see a lot of that in India. I think a lot of more people are accessing the doctors online and are comfortable with it. I think even within the US, payers have started paying for insurance for healthcare through telemedicine. I think where AI has been very helpful, I think, is in consuming large amounts of information, especially within life sciences R&D and within healthcare R&D, which is where I am. Just think about the kind of trials that have been run and at the speed at which they have been run to validate these vaccines or invalidate them. And I think a lot of that would not have been possible without AI, right? Like, for example, what we do is we make sure that the data that you generate, let's say, through these experiments, that is consumable without scientists having to spend a large amount of time trying to just make the data ready to use. And for applications like those, machine learning has been very instrumental and has helped move the needle, for example, in vaccine research and drug research, and that we fundamentally believe is a big shift that is happening. But then again, machine learning has a lot of limitations as well. For example, within life sciences, it's the broad agreement is that you can use machine learning for example, classifying CT scans, right? Whether you know that, okay, I have a subject A with a particular condition, and I have a lot of images where there are quote unquote normal, healthy patients, and you can solve those kind of simpler problems. It's not a simple problem, but it's a problem that is at least repetitive and can be automated to a large extent by machine learning. But what machine learning cannot do, for example, today is generate fundamental biological IP, right? Like, because a lot of times in biology, what you're discovering is not something that fits on an already existing pattern. So you're trying to find something very new. You're trying to find fundamental research where you at the end of the day need these machine learning, not machine learning, but these fundamental scientists who can look at the output that AI gives and make a decision on top. Right? So those are kind of the limits of machine learning, and I think we should be very aware of them. One of the points that I think we discussed was how in this pandemic, machine learning worked to amplify the misinformation. And I think if at anything what the pandemic has shown us is that traditional media, the New York Times and Indian Express of the world, which are not machine learning driven but which are human driven, they were a lot more successful at disseminating the right sort of information. And machine learning, even at its best, was not. So I think there are lots of places where machine learning is still fairly limited and should be understood in that context. Otherwise, I think we will not enter that metaphorical winter sooner or later. And I think everybody who's on this probably group in this panel has been guilty at various points of selling this huge vision of what machine learning can do to investors, to the general public, and so on. And there will be a reckoning for us sooner or later. I do believe that, and I would expect in some part guilty as charged. Yeah.
It's part of the cycle. So
it's part of the cycle. Yeah. There'll be a winter. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Now, you brought up machine learning. So, I mean, I don't know who I should ask this. Maybe I'll go to Roberto on this. But anyone wants to say something on this, feel free to jump in. Let's treat it as a conversation without a moderator. So my question is, okay, we have machine learning tools, part of deep learning tools. What are the other tools or types of AI that were promising but couldn't make it or couldn't cut it during the pandemic? And what can we foresee? What kind of development can we foresee? I mean, the one thing I read about again and again is that don't think of these tools as ends in themselves, but they're a means to an end, right? So anyone wants to go on this? Roberto, I'll start with you, but anyone else wants to join in, Tannya or Swetabh again?
Absolutely. I'll start as you called me on the spot, but definitely it's a conversation, right? So actually the conversation is actually super interesting, and to build on what Swetabh just mentioned, I love what he just said, because he's keeping it real, right? So most of the times when people close their eyes and we talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, we are depicting ourselves in our imagination this future where everything is automated, fully automated. All the data is shared across, and all of these scenarios that might happen in the future, but we are very far from that, right? Machine learning comes with some limitations today, and we need to have more of these real talks to inform people, to educate people of what are the limitations of technology today. At the same time, well, to your question, look, there are definitely specific services today that are not failing to the promise, right? So meaning the technology is there. When you talk about vision, for example, or speech or language, on language, we have seen so much development, recently with NLPs and other technologies there. We're working with startups, for example, that are now able to detect a number of dialects in Arabic, for example, for this region and in general, right? So that are able to push the boundaries of that technology when it comes to language, speech-to-text recognition, for example, and decision models, right, behind this. At the same time, there are scenario-specific services that are definitely already available and are serving the purpose of specific use cases. Think about the proliferation of these bot services. They are built on sort of bot frameworks, and there are already open source bot framework, right, that allow the development of this conversational AI. And a number of brands, a number of entities are adopting more and more of these services, right? So, or think about the way that you need to recognize information within documents. So whether it's forms or specific type of documents, so extracting information from that and automate that more and more and in a faster way. Or think about the way you need to index videos, for example, to extract in-depth metadata from video and audio content, for example. All of this technology is catching up, is definitely developing, right? So we have seen a huge development in these areas, whether it's, again, audio, video, speech, speech to text, text to speech, etc. So in these services. And all of this paired also with advancement when it comes to processing the data and building analytics, so actionable insights out of these data. Applications that can predict, for example, customer churn, that can automatically route customer requests to some other stakeholders within the process, right? So inventory management, that using advanced image processing, for example. So all of these applications on an industrial basis or on specific use cases in different industries, we see it that is already happening. Or wherever there are tedious tasks that are being automated, like invoice processing, we see that there are already a bunch of developments there to make it much faster and more efficient, right? Things like that are developing. Where I think the limit is well, there is a computational limit in terms of processing power and compute. That probably we are addressing with things that will come and are already out there, like quantum computing, that will increase definitely the availability of these technologies. Or think about on a mobile or mobility perspective, the 5G. So we've seen this will be unparalleled or unprecedented development of technology that will allow even more development of sophisticated AI models. But on the other end is more what are the use cases as well, right? So where is the technology? Because technology might be there. It's what are the problems that you are trying to solve? Where is that where is the disconnect, the barrier? And sometimes is a slippery slope, because it comes sometimes to a sort of a reality distortion where you think that that's a relevant use case, and it's the same mistake as when you have startups that they think that they are solving a problem that they're still scratching the surface, right? So, and they're not building something that has achieved the product market fit, so people are going to use. So from a technology perspective, the primary focus is to build this underlying layer of technology that can enable development on top of it. So with an open source or an open approach, and with these principles we said before, in terms of being responsible and allowing this to remove as much as possible unconscious bias from a number of these things that might be very dangerous down the line. If you also allow, or if you also think about scenarios, and a number of these projects have been recently stopped about, there were experiments on having AI machine learning algorithms that were training other algorithms, right? And creating a sort of a chain that ended up being in a very scary sort of scenario where you cannot control it anymore, right? And there is also a concept, on the other hand, of liability. So who is liable when you develop something like that you don't have full control?
Got it. Anyone else wants to jump in? I just want to do a time check. We have about 7 minutes before we wrap up, and I actually want to also, feel free to jump in right now, but I also want to do a kind of like a game, that's probably the best word for it, which is, I want you all to think about yourself before the pandemic and now post the pandemic. And in the last 2 years, can you mention one tool that you've used, AI-based tool that you've used in your personal life and in your professional life? The reason I'm asking this is because I want to frame the kind of possibilities that exist maybe going forward, which were not there just even 2 years ago. So I'll start off. One of the things I did before the pandemic, I wasn't using speech to text in a professional capacity, but now I do. I compose emails by talking to my phone, and sometimes I'm able to write articles as well using the audio speech to text feature, which was not conceivable for me before the pandemic, because I was finding it difficult to stay in one place all the time, hunched over my computer. And so this is what technology helped me do. And again, in my personal life, I use Google Translate a lot. So can each of you go? I mean, I'll start with you, Shweta, then come to you, Tannya, and then Roberto. And the reason I want to really just do this, and as a reminder to all the people who are watching, is let's see what is possible. What's going to happen 2 years down the line?
So something that personally I ended up using was this application. I think that clears out junk photos from your phone, and because my phone has about 23,000 photos, out of which 24,000 I'm never going to see again. So I used AI to clear that up. That was a personal application that I had never used before, and as Roberto said, vision is one of the areas where these kind of things are really possible very quickly. A professional application, I would say that we ended up using a variation of the BERT model to clean up a lot of data at an unprecedented speed to make it available for COVID researchers. And that was a very interesting thing to see. And I think other groups also use that to especially in the earliest days of the pandemic, to find out the best sort of medical advice. This was like 2 months into the pandemic, and there were publications coming north and south, right? So they used that kind of natural language processing to find out the most relevant and most recent advice to doctors, which I thought was a very interesting application.
That was fantastic. Tannya?
Good. Yeah, I'm going to say two. One, I started to learn Arabic this year, and I use Google Translate, heavily, and that's been super helpful. The other one is actually kind of a weird one. It's so I work at VMware, and one of the things that I help out with in my free time is communication, right? And VMware is very big on diversity and inclusion. And something that they've started to mandate is the use of a detection tool to use inclusive language in how we talk, how we send out communications. So I personally, got the first. It was actually a Microsoft product that I use that has that tool embedded in it. But that's the first, because I don't know a whole lot about it. I don't, you can't learn about everything. So for me, that was a great way to kind of access an area that I know is important, but that I wouldn't naturally, be drawn to learning about independently. Professionally, that's something that I used. Yeah.
Fantastic. Roberto?
Awesome. Look, on the personal side, during COVID, I'm not learning Arabic, but my son is. So I also kind of went a little bit heavy on Translate, just to understand what he was trying to tell me and what he was learning. So I also probably used a lot of that. But more interestingly, I would say on the professional side, there are a couple of things I would mention. One is working with a startup in HR where they're trying to apply AI to remove biases from the way curriculums are currently managed by organizations, right? So whether it's starting with gender, which is the usual thing, and that has to do a lot with inequality, for example, of payments of salaries, right? So male and females, but also so how AI can help. Thinking that the process is not only just receiving CVs, they are also doing a lot of videos, so video interviews with candidates, but how can you remove bias in that, right? So because you can detect, hey, this candidate is smiling, and infer that by his smile is an open sort of character, and so on and so forth. So how to leverage that, which is pretty interesting to see the development behind. And the other example is another startup that is working with people of determination, so to help more people of determination to access to technology, so to access to courses and be able to complete these courses online. And they leverage a lot of AI behind in terms of modeling how they are dealing with these courses and simplifying then the courses and making it more efficient for them, right? So it's very interesting. And the stories that are coming out of that startups are just inspiring. If you are exposed to those, it's mind-blowing how we should all share the message with all founders, entrepreneurs out there. Whenever you build a product, you should build for everyone, right? Because it is as if every fifth person that knocks at your door, you would say, I don't care about, I don't mind about your business. Instead, each one of us could be eventually become a person of determination, right? So it impacts every one of us. So these are other two examples. I'm directly involved, and very interesting to see the promising opportunities that we have with technology and AI if applied for good.
Interesting. We're about at the end of our conversation, and one of the things I've noticed here is that AI intersects with everything, and it's such a huge topic we picked for the beginning of this summit, and of course it intersects with every sphere of human endeavor, and we've only not even probably dipped our right pinky into the waters, not even that. But thank you so much. And, this is a conversation from which I personally learned a lot from. And there's another question I wanted to ask about, everyone's talking about what's coming in the next 5-10 years. Everyone's excited about Meta, the metaverse. And then I read an article saying that it's actually Microsoft that is well positioned to take advantage of the metaverse. And that was at Stratechery. And then there are so many multiple conversations we can have about what has come through in this field during the pandemic, including the metaverse, of course, and everything else we discussed. But we will have to keep that for later. And on that note, I want to thank you all. Tannya, thank you so much. Roberto, thank you. Swetabh, thank you. This is a very, very interesting conversation. And I hope, we will all continue this conversation with other people, and it's an ongoing conversation. And we are privileged really to dip ourselves into this conversation in this summer and of course outside. Thank you so much.